Hi, Amy here. I'm going to take the next couple of minutes to introduce you to a tool that I'm finding really useful in thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion issues in course design. Our identity as a small liberal arts institution with devoted teachers that care about learning and about their students means that many of the practices I'm going to talk about are already embedded in your classrooms. But sometimes we integrate these unconsciously, and naming the features, especially as we move a course into an online format, can be really useful. The tool I'm going to talk about is one that's been published by the Center for Urban Education, and I encourage you to check out this website. I've adapted the tool for the F&M context and for building courses online. And I'm going to talk about each of these features of an equity-minded classroom or an equity-minded syllabus in turn over the next couple of minutes. The first feature is being sure that we're creating a sense of belonging for everyone. Making all of our students feel as though they belong is something that comes naturally to us in face-to-face, but it takes more intention, as Kelly's been talking about, when that course is online. Small activities that build trust and community, activities that let students know they're valued, are much more important when you aren't face-to-face. If you were at any of the recent diversity, equity, and inclusion workshops, you might want to look back over any of those notes or the materials that were provided. And you might also benefit from Googling, quote, sense of belonging, unquote, or psychosocial interventions, quote, unquote, for some additional ideas that are relevant to creating this sense of belonging in an online classroom. The second feature of an equity-minded class is having really clear, transparent expectations. And again, this is something that comes naturally to us in a face-to-face environment, but we need to pay much more attention to it when we don't have very much interaction with our students. And let's face it, we've all just got a lot of other things happening in our lives right now. Making expectations clear can include things like using rubrics or providing extra guidance on assignments, providing very specific feedback on scaffolded assignments before a final project or paper is turned in. You also might want to think about providing written as well as audio instructions. And you might think about doing that across time so as not to overwhelm students with information. So providing instructions at different points in the project rather than all up front. I also want to encourage people to think about being really explicit about their expectations with virtual discussions. This is new to most of us, and it's going to be important to be transparent here. I know it's really hard to look at a Brady Bunch view of a Zoom room when all you really see are students' names and you're not getting any body language or feedback. But then again, you don't really want to invade student privacy. One of the approaches you might take here is to talk with students about why it's beneficial to you and to them to be able to see each other's faces, or at least to get some feedback from each other. Nonverbal feedback, whether that's a thumbs up emoji icon or smiling faces and nodding, or other icons like slow it down or I'm not with you anymore. This might make students, again, it might make students more comfortable and help them understand about why it's important to use their video function, even if they only use their video function at the outset of a class or when they're doing small group work. The third feature of an equity-minded classroom is to emphasize partnerships and partnerships between you and your students as well as among your students. Again, this is something that we typically do quite naturally in a classroom, in a laboratory, in a studio space, but it's difficult to establish this in an online environment. I also want to talk here specifically about some of the factors that faculty might want to be taking into consideration. Establishing that balance between your expertise and your classroom leadership with creating a collaborative class space depends on a variety of factors, including race, age, ethnicity, gender, and content, among other things. And finding that balance can be really tricky. Kelly or I are happy to talk further about ways that you as an individual with a particular set of identities can be seen as a partner in student learning without necessarily losing any authority when you're teaching online. So reach out to us as it makes sense to. Many of us, particularly those of us who are parents, also know something about the growth mindset. This could be something to really emphasize in an equity-minded classroom and online. If you're unfamiliar with growth mindset, I encourage you to do some Googling. There are lots of articles and lots of videos out there. And the basic idea of the growth mindset is that failure offers us opportunities, that mistakes are opportunities to learn, that innate ability is important, but so is hard work, that anybody can learn how to do, can be successful in any content area, and that hard work is going to be as, if not more important, to determining your grade in the end. And during the pandemic crisis, when mental health risks are particularly high, it can be especially important to remind students that mistakes are part of learning and that they're not personal failings, and that their hard work and resiliency is going to pay off in the long run. These ideas, this idea of a growth mindset, can be especially important to communicate to minoritized populations. In that online environment that we're moving to, it can also be especially important that students see role models that reflect their identities in their courses. This can mean expanding your reading lists or your content lists, or it can mean being more transparent about the identities and the perspectives of the scholars that you're using. You can also be much more intentional about selecting inclusive imagery and become more aware of the kinds of cultural differences that are present in your classrooms. I'll have more to say about this in a minute. Again, if this is an area that's new to you, this idea of finding ways to mirror student identities in the classroom, I encourage you to take your subject topic and go ahead and Google it along with keywords like social justice, race and ethnicity, or minoritization. There are lots of resources out there. There are some websites out there with long lists of resources. And this is true in disciplinary areas, even for disciplinary areas like math or physics. If this is of interest to you, I know you'll be able to find some ideas for how to achieve this in your online class. The last feature of the Center for Urban Education's list for creating equity-minded classrooms is to acknowledge the structural barriers that exist to equity. Again, if this is a new idea to you, I encourage you to pause and have a look at this graphic and to consider how we move from the ideas of equality to ideas of equity, and how the graphic sort of demonstrates that there are structural barriers that can be removed so that all of our students can be successful. Well, these ideas that there are structural barriers, that there is a dominant power and cultural dynamics at play in the globe, in America, in higher education as an institution, and in our classroom, those are often embedded in some classes, but we can also be bringing those ideas into other courses that aren't focused on equity per se. It could be that you have a particular interest in doing this and adding this dimension to your course, as COVID-19 has really accentuated the kinds of disparities that are embedded in our world. The CUE website, Center for Urban Education website, has some great resources for this, and I want to talk about just a couple of ways that that classrooms can have dominant cultural expectations. Many of us like lecturing, and certainly this is a great way to present a lot of content. But it's also lecturing or presentation by an expert is also a cultural way of learning. And other cultures learn through much more experiential or collaborative efforts. So think about including more collaborative, active learning, experiential learning processes in your online course and not just relying completely on a lecture format. It's also important in discussions to think about the expectations we have for how students participate in discussions and who is and isn't included in a discussion. So raising your hand, being vocal, being aggressive, being assertive, debate, these are all have cultural aspects to them. And there will be some students who prefer to be more reflective, who are more introspective, who are more will find more comfort in working in a one-on-one or a small group scenario. So diversifying how it is you're allowing students to participate can be really important. Another thing to think about is how you present information. I know I, as somebody who has lectured a lot in my life, loved the idea of taking a really complicated topic and breaking it down into subtopics in a really linear and progressive fashion. But there are other ways of approaching that where you help students identify a main idea and then build and connect that to their lives and the importance in their lives, and then build the facts or the sub-ideas into that larger idea rather than sort of starting with the facts and building up into the main idea. We also have expectations in our classes about how language is used, and think about whether there are times that you might expand the kind of language that's acceptable in your classroom from just being academic, formal, vocabulary use of the field kinds of conversations or discussions, and when it might be more appropriate to have a conversational kind of tone to a classroom. And lastly, think about the ways in which you are assessing students. So exams, discussion participation, papers are all pretty traditional ways to assess students. There are lots of opportunities for creative ways. This is one that I've become recently intrigued by, this idea of a one-page graphic that captures, synthesizes, integrates, and expresses ideas both in writing, but also allows for use of imagery and graphic symbols. So that's it. Those are the main features of ways to include equity-mindedness in your classroom. That's the overview. You'll see that there's also an assignment in this module in the Canvas Institute that asks you to put these ideas that puts these ideas into a general classroom context to give you some more examples, and also gives you a chance to do some tailoring of these ideas for your own course. All right, let us know if you have any questions. Thanks for listening.